Bleach smells like peace. Ammonia burns the nostrils, stripping away memory, leaving only white linoleum and silence. Nora dragged the mop in a figure eight, ignoring the sneers from the trauma surgeons sipping artisanal espresso. A spilled latte was an easy fix. A severed artery took a little more work. Nora wore a slate-gray jumpsuit that hung off her frame like a physical apology. It was 2 sizes too big, stiff with industrial detergent, and zipped right up to the collarbone. She liked the weight of it. It was a heavy, shapeless, beautifully anonymous thing. In the hyper-modern glass and chrome corridors of St. Jude's Concierge Clinic, invisibility was a commodity she valued far above her meager hourly wage. She squeezed the mop handle, relishing the mechanical click-clatter of the wringer. Squeak, drag, squeak, drag. St. Jude's wasn't a place for the sick. It was a place for the wealthy who happened to feel unwell. The air here didn't smell of sickness. It smelled of eucalyptus diffusers, expensive catered lunches, and the crisp, starchy arrogance of freshly pressed scrubs. Nora focused on the floorboards. She preferred the floor. It never lied, it never complained, and it only ever asked to be scrubbed. Watch it maintenance. Dr. Pierce strode past his leather loafers, leaving a trail of muddy slush across the wet linoleum Nora had just spent 10 minutes buffing. He didn't look down. He didn't look at her at all. Beside him, Nurse Chloe giggled at something he'd said, her tablet clutched to her chest. Nora stopped. She leaned her chin on the top of the wooden mop handle. Her knuckles wrapped around the wood were a map of jagged, faded white scars. She felt the familiar dull throb at the base of her skull, a phantom echo of rotor wash and hot desert wind, and forced it down. She took a slow breath, inhaling the sharp tang of floor wax. She dragged the mop back over the mud. Just clean the floor, Nora. 10 minutes later, she was emptying the biohazard bins in the overflow waiting area. It was quiet, save for the low hum of the HVAC unit. Sitting in a leather recliner near the corner was a man in his 50s. His golf shirt was soaked through with sweat. Nora tied off the red plastic bag. As she lifted it, her ears caught a sound. It was faint, a subtle wet hitch at the base of the man's throat. She stopped. She looked at him from the corner of her eye. His skin was pale, carrying a faint dusky blue tint around the lips. But it was his neck that made the hair on her arm stand up. The jugular vein was distended thick and pulsing like a garden hose under pressure. His chest rose unevenly. The left side lagged behind the right. Tension pneumothorax her brain supplied instantly. Or acute cardiac tamponade. Nora closed her eyes. She gripped the plastic bag so hard her nails bit into her palms. Not your circus. Not your monkeys. She was a janitor. She pushed a cart. She didn't carry a stethoscope anymore. She had surrendered her license, buried her past, and traded the nightmares of Damascus and Helmand Province for a mop bucket. But the man wheezed again. A desperate drowning sound. Nora cursed silently. She left the trash cart and walked briskly down the hall to the nurse's station. Chloe was tapping at her phone, filing her nails with an emery board. "Hey," Nora said. Her voice was like crushed gravel, rough, from years of disuse and too many cheap cigarettes. Chloe didn't look up. "Can't you see I'm busy? If there's a spill in triage, put a cone down. I'll call dispatch." "The guy in chair 4, Nora said, ignoring the dismissal. "His neck veins are bulging and he's breathing shallow 30 a minute. Tracheal deviation to the right. You need to get him on a monitor. Now. Chloe finally stopped filing. She looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows pinching together in a mix of confusion and deep offense. She looked Nora up and down, taking in the oversized gray jumpsuit, the wet boots, the heavy tool belt resting on her hips. "Excuse me," Chloe laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Are you trying to give me a clinical handoff, maintenance? I'm telling you he's crashing." Nora kept her voice flat, devoid of the panic she knew Chloe expected. Dr. Pierce stepped out of the break room, holding a ceramic mug. "Is there a problem here?" "Your janitor is playing Dr. Pierce," Chloe said, rolling her eyes. "She's diagnosing the walk-ins." Pierce sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at Nora with the exhausted patience of a parent dealing with a toddler. "Nora Wright, listen. I know working in a hospital makes you pick up the lingo from watching TV. But let's leave the medicine to the professionals with degrees. Go check the paper towel dispensers in the third-floor restrooms. They're jamming again." Nora stared at him. She looked at his clean, soft hands. Hands that had never slipped on hot crimson in the back of a shaking Humvee. Hands that had never had to clamp a severed artery in pitch darkness while mortar shells rained down. She felt a bitter, acidic laugh bubbling in her throat. She swallowed it. She wanted to argue. Every instinct she had forged in JSOC told her to physically move these idiots out of the way and save the man in the lobby. But then the questions would start. The administration, the background checks, the unearthing of a history she had fought so hard to bury. Her shoulders slumped. She let the mask of the dull, invisible maintenance woman fall back over her face. "Right," Nora muttered. "Paper towels. Got it." She turned and walked away. The squeak of her boots on the linoleum sounded entirely like defeat. She stepped into the custodial closet, locking the door behind her. The smell of ammonia was overwhelming in the tight space. She sank onto an overturned bucket, resting her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her calloused hands. Her fingers were trembling. Just do the job, she told herself. You're not a combat medic anymore. You're not a nurse. You're a ghost. She sat in the dark closet, listening to the drip of a leaky faucet, trying to drown out the memory of chopper blades and the sticky coppery smell of a trauma ward. At exactly 3:14 p.m., the illusion of safety shattered. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a violent, sickening drop in air pressure that popped Nora's ears in the darkness of the closet. The heavy metal door rattled in its frame. A split second later, the world tore open. It was a deep, structural roar. A subterranean gas main running directly beneath the clinic's VIP wing had ruptured and ignited. The shockwave ripped upward through the foundation. Nora was thrown backward off the bucket, slamming into the concrete wall of the closet. The lights died instantly. The emergency sirens didn't even have time to wind up before the drywall ceiling gave way, collapsing into the room in a choking cascade of dust and pulverized plaster. For 10 seconds, there was nothing but sensory deprivation. Nora lay on the floor, blinking into the pitch black. Dust coated her tongue, tasting of chalk and burnt ozone. A high-pitched electronic ringing whined in her ears. Contact. The word flared in her mind unbidden. Her body moved before her conscious brain could catch up. She rolled onto her stomach, coughing up a mouthful of drywall dust, and pushed herself to her knees. Her left shoulder screamed in protest, but she ignored it. Pain was just data. Right now, it was irrelevant. She blindly felt around her tool belt. Flashlight. She clicked it on. The beam cut through the thick, swirling gray air like a lightsaber. She kicked the jammed metal door open. The pristine eucalyptus-scented corridor of St. Jude's no longer existed. The glass walls of the atrium had exploded inward, carpeting the floor in millions of jagged shards. Exposed wiring hung from the fractured ceiling, spitting angry blue sparks that illuminated the smoke. The sprinkler system groaned to life, spitting a weak rust-colored drizzle over the wreckage. And then the screaming started. High, thin, and terrified, Nora stepped out of the closet. The heavy gray jumpsuit suddenly didn't feel like a disguise anymore. It felt like armor. She found Dr. Pierce first. He was sitting on the floor near the shattered nurse's station, his legs splayed out in front of him. A large triangular piece of glass was buried deep in his left bicep. He was staring at it, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish completely paralyzed by the sight of his own tissue. Nurse Chloe was huddled under a desk, sobbing hysterically, her hands clamped over her ears. "Pierce," Nora barked. He didn't blink. He just stared at his arm. Nora didn't have time for bedside manner. She marched over, grabbed the collar of his expensive scrubs, and shook him violently. "Pierce, look at me," he gasped, his eyes snapping to hers. The glass. Don't pull it out. Leave it," Nora commanded, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, authoritative cadence she hadn't used since Kabul. "Apply pressure around the wound, not on it. Elevate the arm. Do you understand me?" Pierce stammered, entirely lost. Nora dropped him. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping through the gloom. She remembered the man in chair 4. She found him 20 feet away. He had been thrown from the recliner when the floor buckled. A massive slab of the ceiling grid, heavy with lighting fixtures and ductwork, had come down directly on his lower half. Nora rushed over, sliding the last few feet on her knees over the glass. She shined the light on his face. His skin was gray. His lips were heavily cyanotic now. His breathing was nothing but shallow, agonizing gasps. She looked down. The heavy metal beam had crushed his right thigh, and beneath it, a dark viscous pool was spreading rapidly across the white tiles, mixing with the sprinkler water. It was bright red, pulsing, femoral artery, pinned. Nora's hands hovered over the man for a fraction of a second. She felt a sickening wave of vertigo. The dust, the smell of fresh blood, the screaming, it was all dragging her back. She was terrified, not of the blood, but of herself. If she did this, there was no going back to the mop bucket. The man choked, a bloody froth appearing at the corner of his mouth. Nora bared her teeth. She swore loudly and brutally into the smoke. She ripped the heavy canvas tool belt off her waist. "Chloe," Nora roared, a sound so feral it made the nurse flinch under the desk. "Get your ass out here right now." Chloe scrambled out, trembling violently. I don't know what to do." "You hold the light." Nora shoved the heavy flashlight into the nurse's shaking hands. "Point it at his leg. Do not drop it, or I will break your fingers." Nora reached into her pocket. She didn't have a trauma kit. She didn't have combat gauze, or a cat tourniquet, or a scalpel. She had a janitor's card buried under rubble. She pulled out a thick, heavy-duty industrial zip tie and a pair of rusty trauma shears she secretly carried out of pure, stubborn habit. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the man's pant leg and sliced the fabric open with brutal efficiency, exposing the mangled flesh of his thigh. The blood was spurting in rhythm with his failing heart. "Oh God," Chloe retched, turning her head away. "Keep the light steady," Nora snapped. She wrapped the heavy zip tie high and tight around the man's upper thigh, just below the groin. She pulled it as tight as her bare hands could manage. The plastic teeth clicked violently. But the bleeding didn't stop entirely. The zip tie wasn't thick enough. It was cutting into the tissue, but not fully occluding the artery. Nora looked around wildly. She snatched a thick steel crescent wrench from her dropped tool belt. She slid the handle of the wrench under the zip tie. With a grunt of exertion, she began to twist it, using the wrench as a makeshift windlass. 1 rotation. 2. The heavy plastic bit deep into the muscle. The man groaned in agony, his eyes rolling back. "Sorry, buddy. Better losing the leg than your life," Nora muttered, twisting it a 3rd time. The pulsing crimson flow slowed, then stopped. Nora secured the end of the wrench with a roll of heavy duct tape from her belt, wrapping it entirely around his leg to lock the makeshift tourniquet in place. She wiped a streak of sweat and drywall dust from her forehead, leaving a muddy smear. She looked up. Dr. Pierce was staring at her from across the hall, clutching his wounded arm. His eyes were wide with utter shock, the arrogant sneer completely erased, replaced by the dawning realization that the woman he had just ordered to fix a paper towel dispenser had just executed a flawless improvised field amputation protocol in under 60 seconds. Nora didn't look at him. She dropped her hands to the patient's chest. The bleeding was stopped, but the man was suffocating. The tension pneumothorax had reached critical mass. His trachea was visibly pushed to the right side of his throat. "His lung is collapsing," Nora said, talking to herself more than Chloe. "Pressure is crushing his heart. I need a needle, large bore." We don't have crash carts here," Chloe stammered. "They're locked in the pharmacy, the rubble." Nora looked at the man's chest. He had maybe 2 minutes before his heart stopped. She stood up her gray jumpsuit soaked in dark, wet patches. She looked around the ruined clinic, her eyes scanning the debris with the cold, calculating geometry of a woman who had once saved a Marine's life using a ballpoint pen and a piece of rubber tubing. "Watch him," Nora ordered. She turned and sprinted toward the shattered remains of the supply closet. Smoke hung in the corridor, thick and acrid, burning her eyes until they watered. The supply closet was entirely gone, buried under a collapsed section of the HVAC matrix. Metal ductwork groaned overhead, swaying precariously. Nora didn't stop moving. She couldn't. The phantom drumbeat of mortar fire was pounding in her skull, perfectly synchronized with her racing pulse. She pivoted away from the closet, her eyes locking onto a shattered aesthetic medicine cart, half crushed beneath a fallen marble pillar. St. Jude's didn't stock trauma gear, but they had an endless supply of IV fluids for the hungover executives who paid for premium hydration therapy. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the broken glass biting through her canvas pants. Her bare hands tore through the wreckage. Vials of B12 shattered. Syringes scattered like plastic bones. Come on. Her fingers closed around a stiff plastic blister pack. A 14-gauge intravenous catheter. It was thick, brutal, meant for rapid fluid resuscitation. Right now, it was a lifeline. Nora shoved the needle into her pocket and sprinted back. The man in chair 4 had stopped thrashing. That was the worst sign of all. His chest was entirely still on the right side, ballooned outward under the pressure of the trapped air crushing his lungs and heart. His lips were no longer blue. They were an ugly mottled gray, Dr. Pierce was still sitting against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm, muttering something incoherent. Chloe was weeping openly, her face buried in her knees. They were utterly useless. The civilized world had shattered, and they didn't know how to breathe in the ruins. Nora dropped heavily beside the dying man. She ripped the plastic wrapper off the catheter with her teeth, spitting the scrap of plastic onto the bloody floor. She didn't have betadine. She didn't have alcohol. She didn't have gloves. Her hands were coated in drywall dust motor oil from the mop bucket and the man's own blood. Forgive the infection, she thought grimly. Just survive the minute. She ran her thumb down the man's collarbone, pressing hard into the clammy, sweating flesh. She found the sternal angle, counted down. First rib, second rib, second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line. Her hand hovered. A violent tremor racked her fingers. Suddenly, she wasn't in a high-end clinic in the city. She was in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter over the Korengal Valley. The man under her wasn't a 50-year-old executive. He was a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, missing half his jaw, screaming for his mother, while she shoved a needle into his chest. Bile rose in her throat. She swallowed it down, tasting copper. "Stay with me," Nora whispered. It was a prayer to the ghost in the helicopter as much as the man on the floor. She gripped the heavy plastic hub of the catheter. She positioned the tip just over the third rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle, angled it precisely at 90 degrees, and drove it downward. Flesh parted. Muscle resisted dense and rubbery before giving way with a sickening wet pop as the needle breached the pleural space. Instantly, a sharp, violent hiss erupted from the hub of the needle. It sounded like a slashed tire. Stale, trapped air foul with the metallic stench of internal bleeding rushed out of the man's chest under immense pressure. A fine spray of atomized blood misted over Nora's knuckles. She quickly withdrew the steel stylet, leaving the flexible plastic catheter in place, and tossed the sharp onto the floor. Almost immediately, the man's chest fell. The terrible ballooning tension vanished. His trachea, previously shoved hard to the right, slowly shifted back toward the center of his throat. He gasped. It was a horrific, wet, rattling sound, but it was a real breath. Air rushed into his remaining functional lung. The dusky gray of his face began to recede, chased away by the faint, returning flush of oxygenated blood. Nora sat back on her heels. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving a cold, hollow void in her stomach. Her shoulders slumped. The heavy gray jumpsuit felt like a lead blanket pulling her down to the floor. She looked at her hands. They were trembling violently, now stained crimson up to the wrists. She wiped them on her thighs, leaving long, rust-colored streaks on the gray fabric. It didn't help. The blood was in the creases of her knuckles. It was under her fingernails. It was exactly where she had promised herself it would never be again. How? The voice was weak, shaky. Nora turned her head slowly. Dr. Pierce was staring at her. The arrogant sneer, the crisp superiority of the concierge physician, it was all gone, burned away by the explosion, and the sheer brutal reality of what he had just witnessed. He looked at the makeshift wrench tourniquet. He looked at the chest dart. "How did you do that?" Pierce asked. His voice cracked. "Who are you?" Nora looked at him. She felt a profound, exhausting apathy. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a fraud who had just blown her cover. "I'm the maintenance woman," Nora said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Keep pressure on your arm, Doc. You're still bleeding." She didn't wait for his response. Heavy rhythmic thudding echoed from the far end of the corridor. Flashlight beams cut through the smoke, bright and blinding. "Fire department, call out!" a gruff voice bellowed. "Over here!" Chloe shrieked, finally finding her voice. "We need help! Oh my God, please!" First responders flooded the ruined atrium. They moved in a chaotic but practiced ballet of heavy turnout gear, clinking carabiners, and the crackle of two-way radios. The smell of diesel exhaust and fresh night air rolled in with them, cutting through the stench of dust and copper. Nora pushed herself backward, sliding into the deep shadows cast by a collapsed section of the wall. A paramedic in a high-visibility jacket rushed over to the man on the floor. He dropped his heavy trauma bag, his eyes scanning the scene rapidly. He saw the pinned leg. He reached for his shears, ready to cut the pant leg, but stopped. He stared at the heavy steel crescent wrench locked into the bloody zip tie secured perfectly with duct tape. Then his eyes moved up to the patient's chest. He saw the 14-gauge catheter protruding from the second intercostal space, perfectly placed, venting the pneumothorax. The paramedic froze. He looked up, his flashlight sweeping over Dr. Pierce. "Doc," the paramedic said, his voice laced with profound respect. "Hell of a job. You didn't have a kit. This windlass, this is flawless. You bought this guy 20 minutes he didn't have." Pierce opened his mouth. He looked at his own clean, uncalloused hands, currently pressing a gauze pad against his minor laceration. He looked at the paramedic. Then he looked past him into the shadows. "It wasn't me," Pierce whispered, the reality of his own inadequacy sitting heavy in his throat. "It was her." The paramedic followed Pierce's gaze. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, pinning Nora against the wall. She stood there, bathed in the harsh white light. The oversized gray jumpsuit was ruined, soaked in sweat and blood. Her hair was matted with drywall dust. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes hollow, guarded, and ancient. The paramedic stood up slowly. He recognized the posture. He recognized the blank 1,000-yard stare that only came from seeing the worst of the world and surviving it. He looked back down at the wrench. It wasn't civilian medicine. It was brutal, effective, and forged in a war zone. "TCCC," the paramedic said softly, using the acronym for Tactical Combat Casualty Care. He took a step toward her. "Where did you serve, Sister Fallujah, Kandahar, Diur?" Nora didn't answer. Her jaw clenched. The walls were closing in again. The spotlight was on her, dragging her past out of the shallow grave she had dug for it. If she spoke, there would be police reports. There would be questions from administrators. They would run her name. They would find the honorable discharge, the silver star she had thrown in a river, the medical license she had voluntarily surrendered when her hands wouldn't stop shaking in the OR. She couldn't do it. Nora picked up her broken mop handle from the rubble. She gripped it tight, needing the physical anchor to the present. "Patient stable," Nora rasped, her voice rough. "Tourniquet applied 14 minutes ago. Sternal dart is patent. He needs a real chest tube and a vascular surgeon." "Wait," the paramedic said, holding up a hand. "I need your name for the handoff. You saved his life." "I clean the floors," Nora said. She turned away. "Hey, you can't just leave," Dr. Pierce called out, stumbling to his feet. "Nora, wait!" But she was already moving. She slipped through a jagged gap in the collapsed glass wall, stepping out into the frigid night air. Red and blue emergency lights washed over the street, painting the wet pavement in violent flashing colors. The air outside smelled of rain and exhaust. Nora walked past a group of firefighters hauling heavy rescue tools. They didn't look twice at the dust-covered janitor limping away from the wreckage. To them, she was just another lucky survivor, another civilian. She reached into her pocket, her bloody fingers pulling out a crumpled pack of stale cigarettes. She stuck one between her lips and struck a match. The flame briefly illuminated her scarred knuckles before she shook it out. She inhaled deeply the cheap tobacco burning her lungs. It felt grounding, real. Behind her, paramedics were loading the man onto a stretcher. He was alive. The ghost in the helicopter was still dead, but the man in the lobby was alive. It was an uneven trade, a chaotic balancing of the scales that would never truly make sense. Nora exhaled a thick cloud of smoke into the night. She adjusted the collar of her ruined gray jumpsuit, shoved her hands deep into her pockets, and began to walk. The heavy squeak of her boots against the pavement was the only sound she left behind, fading into the sirens until the maintenance woman was gone, completely swallowed by the dark. Did this story grab you by the throat? The world is full of hidden heroes carrying scars we can't see, fighting battles we know nothing about. If Nora's raw, unapologetic strength moved you, drop a like and share this video with someone who appreciates real, gritty storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We have more intense, deeply human stories coming your way every week. Stay strong and keep watching.